Peter Singer is a controversial figure, and it's not entirely surprising. He has advanced theses that have caused a little bit of shock. He's argued, for example, that not only should abortion be permitted to the moment of pregnancy, but people should be able to kill their infants up to the age of 28 days, essentially without restriction.
D'Souza's pretty derpy and has had a lot of difficulty grasping nuanced positions and arguments before, but on this issue I think he's simply a fucking liar. On Singer's Princeton faculty page, there's an FAQ in which he explains his view on this. He has said that killing a newborn baby is never equivalent to killing a person, that is, a being who wants to go on living. That doesn't mean that it is not almost always a terrible thing to do. He also says that, although a normal newborn baby has no sense of the future and therefore is not a person, that does not mean that it is alright to kill such a baby. It only means that the wrong done to the infant is not as great as the wrong that would be done to a person who was killed. But in our society, there are many couples who would be very happy to love and care for that child. Hence, even if the parents do not want their own child, it would be wrong to kill it. This doesn't at all sound like he believes that infanticide should be allowed essentially without restriction. Rather, it sounds to me like Singer believes that it would be entirely appropriate to restrict parents from killing their children merely because they don't want them. Now we get to D'Souza's favorite non sequitur argument against atheism.
But we have had great experiments in secularism in the last century, in the 20th century, where for the first time you had thinkers and leaders who tried to implement, you might say, secular utopia. Yes, I'm thinking, for example, of Mao in China, I'm thinking of Stalin in Russia, I'm thinking of the Nazi regime in Germany, but not just those three. I'm thinking of Pol Pot in Indochina, Enver Hoxha, Kim Jong-il, Fidel Castro, numerous experiments to do what? In a sense, to create a new man and a new utopia liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality. Now, some people like to say, well, what about the crimes of religion? But quite interestingly, the crimes of religion, even the crimes of radical Islam, are infinitesimal when compared to the crimes, one may say, of trying to create the atheist secular society.
Of course, this is a vast oversimplification. The violence carried out by Pol Pot, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong was motivated not by atheism or secularism per se, but rather by the dogmatic faith they had in their own kooky interpretations of dialectical materialism, which they treated very much like a religion. Dogmatism is frequently dangerous and is ubiquitous among authoritarian regimes, regardless of whether they are religious or secular. However, I highly doubt that a dictatorship could ever be successfully based on skepticism. Skeptics hold that all ideas ought to be open to challenge and scrutiny, including the idea of skepticism itself. I don't see how a dictatorship that allowed public scrutiny could possibly maintain absolute power. Also, this debate was supposed to be about whether a god exists. Even if the idea that a god does not exist did actually lead to mass murder, that wouldn't make it false.
Let's talk about whether we ought to believe God exists. That's surely the starting point. Even if you think that the consequences of atheism are not going to be good, Dinesh D'Souza obviously does, I don't, as I will say a little bit more about later, still, you surely ought to be interested in the basic question, does God exist or not? And we haven't really heard any argument in the 15 minutes opening statement for that, except that if we don't believe it, the consequence is going to be bad. But, you know, sometimes things are true, even though we don't like the consequences of them.
Singer's main argument is not against a god per se, but rather the particular conception which defines Yahweh as all-loving and all-powerful.
The world around us contains an immensity of suffering. As far as we know, it always has contained, as long as there have been sentient beings, which goes back many millions of years, an immensity of suffering. Can we really believe that a God who is described as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good has created such a world? I think this is the major stumbling block to belief in the Christian God. It's always been, for me, the thing that has made it impossible for me to believe in such a God. A God who deliberately and knowingly created a world like this one could not be a good being. We might say either this kind of God was evil or this God was a bungler. There are no other options.
Singer acknowledges the usual apologetic response that the world contains suffering because of human free will, and shifts the focus onto the suffering that is not caused by human free will.
It is still the case that there is a lot of suffering in the world that is not explained by this. Because there is a lot of suffering in the world that is nothing to do with anyone's free will. We all know that, we've all seen it. We've all seen natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, droughts, diseases, which strike people down, cause them to suffer, cause them to die, sometimes horrible, agonizing deaths, drawn-out deaths, or cause them to live in unspeakable afflictions, agony, constantly hungry or thirsty because of a drought, perhaps, that has caused crops to fail. And we can't explain that in terms of free will. It has nothing to do with free will. Nor can we explain it in terms of saying that we are fallen, as Christians tend to say, and therefore none of us are innocent. Because even if you believe that, and let me say, I think it would be a totally monstrous doctrine to believe that God would create a world in which, let's say, a 2-year-old child would die a slow and lingering death from hunger and thirst because that baby's alleged ancestors, Adam and Eve, sinned. Again, I would think that would be a monstrous God who could make a baby suffer for that reason. But even if you still think that, even if you still think that the suffering of that baby is somehow deserved because of original sin, what about the suffering of non-human animals?
Even if it is the case that a god allows humans to harm each other because he doesn't want to rob them of free will, and that natural disasters harm humans because of original sin, which is a consequence of free will, that doesn't explain why it is that animals suffer. Why must animals suffer the consequence of humans abusing their free will?